Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. With the Russia-Ukraine conflict still ongoing, are we entering a dark age for arms control? Let's find out in today's program. The Russian Defense Ministry said on Thursday that its forces continued attack on Ukraine's military facilities. NATO members have met to discuss supplying more weapons to Ukraine. These include heavy armaments that may be decisive, some say, in changing the course of the conflict. Since the war started in late February, Russia's political relationship with the West has free-falled. The fraught atmosphere between Washington and Moscow also threatens existing nuclear arms treaties. On April the 8th, 2010, Russia and the United States signed the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, also known as New START, which both sides agreed to extend for 5 years in 2021. The treaty is the last remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the two powers. With the bilateral ties now being strained, are we going to see a second nuclear arms race in the world? Is arms control even possible in the new world order? Let's loop in our panelists. Joining me, Peter Kuznick from Washington, D.C., professor of history from American University. In St. Petersburg, Andrei Pavlov, chair of the Strategic and Arms Control Studies Master's Degree Program from St. Petersburg State University. Shending Li, professor from the Institute of International Studies in Shanghai with Fudan University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. This is an important topic, a topic that defined the Cold War and now likely to define years to come. Now, Professor Kuznick, tell me more about your assessment of the credibility now of the New START.
Well, I think the New START treaty is relatively safe. I don't hear any discussion of abandoning the New START treaty. And it's been extended. We know that President Trump refused to extend it. Putin had appealed repeatedly to the United States to extend it when it ended in 2021. And one of the first things that Biden did was extend the New START treaty. It ends in 2026, in February. The chances of the United States Senate ratifying a new treaty, which would require 2/3 of the vote, is almost zero right now. So I think we're safe until 2026, but then after that, all bets are off, and the possibility of a new nuclear arms race, like we saw in the Cold War, becomes much more real and much more dangerous.
Okay. Professor Pavlov.
Oh, well, I agree with my American colleague. I also sure that for the next 4 years, the New START will stay in force. But of course, it was difficult even before this contemporary crisis started. We suppose that it will be difficult to develop a new treaty. But now it's even more difficult to even develop a mutually satisfactory treaty. But I don't think that the situation is absolutely hopeless. I think that the situation today is very unstable, changeable, and we don't know how this crisis will develop in the nearest future. So I believe that Russia and the United States understand that in their long-term interests is to have certain mutually binding agreements limiting nuclear weapons and providing for certain transparency.
Professor Shen, your thoughts?
Basically, I agree with the other two panelists because the New START has permitted both Moscow and Washington each to possess some 1,500 nuclear warheads or nuclear weapons. That would be enough to destroy each other for several times. Therefore, they do not have a need to build more, despite their deep-rooted distrust and the ongoing Ukraine crisis. They do not have a need. But also, I see no hope that they are going to have a constructive mood to discuss how to implement, how to verify, and how to continue to extend or even to have a deeper, DEEPER, deeper nuclear reduction.
Not only the New START, but also the current situation across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, between the European countries and the United States. Professor Kuznick, if you read today's Washington Post, you will see a huge story about the B-61. Now, that is a legacy of the Cold War, of course. Every one of those 100 B-61 will be able to have 11 times the impact of Hiroshima. Now, that was coming from the Cold War, but now there are voices inside Washington talking about expansion of deployment inside Europe as a result of growing concern and fear against Russia. Professor Kuznick, your thoughts?
I think we're at a very precarious moment in history right now. It's the most dangerous time, the most threatening time in terms of the possibility of world war and nuclear war that we've seen in the past 60 years, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the hawks on all sides are prevailing right now. There's very little talk of peace. There's very little talk of threat reduction. And there seems to be a reliance increasingly on military measures right now. So we see calls for more arms. The idea is that one side has to prevail on the battlefield before there's going to be any serious peace negotiations. And so I see this heightening threat. And the possibility of the war in Ukraine expanding beyond Ukraine's borders is very, very real right now. And we've had more discussion of the nuclear threat in the United States and around the world than we've seen in decades. That could be something good because we have to be aware of this threat has been with us, but it's also potentially very, very dangerous as countries are depending more on their nuclear arsenals.
Yeah.
More and more countries feel like they want nuclear weapons right now to defend themselves. And the United States and Russia and China are, if anything, relying more and not less, again, on nuclear weapons and nuclear threats. The Russians have used the threat of nuclear weapons very effectively. NATO has been very hesitant to get either militarily involved or even to deploy certain weapon systems. And the reason why there's so much hesitation is because they don't want to see this escalate into World War III and potentially a nuclear war. So I think we're in a very dangerous time right now.
Of course, I would have a different perspective from Professor Pavlov. During the Cold War, many sites across the European continent were storing the nuclear weapons. That was, of course, during the Cold War time. Now, much more limited. How do you see the trend likely to be? Meanwhile, Russian president was being quoted in the press about possible to not ruling out a nuclear war, but rather later the spokesperson walked back in rhetorics. So exactly what is the perspective of Russia today?
Well, Russia, I think, has a very clear nuclear strategy and nuclear policy in the sphere of nuclear deterrence. Not so long ago, Russia for the first time published a specific document on the background of Russian policy in the sphere of nuclear strategy and the cases when Russia can use nuclear weapons are listed there. So I haven't seen any shift from that position recently or any time before. And I think it will stay this way. So it's a very short document. Of course, I would not repeat what is written there, and it's translated in English, so you can easily find it. The main idea of this document is nuclear weapons are regarded only as a mean of deterrence, not in any other ways.
Well, the Russia-Ukraine war going on reminds people of the fear of nuclear interaction, nuclear war interaction. Professor Shen, there are other hotspot issues involving nuclear. For example, the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, the Iran nuclear issue. Now, these two are having apparently a very different fate right now. Well, the Russia-Ukraine crisis going on, the Iran nuclear issue seem to see some possible light at the end of the tunnel. Professor Shen, how do you see these two very distinctive case studies?
Well, some countries may feel insecure and they want to find a nuclear weapon solution to fix this challenge. But that would end with the security dilemma that the countries they want to deter may feel more pressure of insecurity. That would force the other side to be driven to think about nuclear. And for the tension between India and Pakistan, they virtually have nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have never deterred their tension. Conventional conflict still happen. But if a nuclear weapon would exist under that circumstance, nuclear credibility deterrence could either fail or one would be driven to honor the deterrence. Neither situation would bring the region more secure. Therefore, the best solution is to meet and talk to give mutual concession, not a mutual winning or mutual losing, but mutual concession. India would say, I would not use nuclear weapons against Pakistan, and Pakistan would teach a lesson for some terrorists harboring in that country. That is the only political solution. Talk, reducing each other's fear of insecurity. That would help the mankind not to think about nuclear.
Right. The concept and the logic are so clear, but when it comes to reality, it's a very different story. So how do you see the issue of Korean Peninsula nuclear issue and the Iran nuclear issue now seem to be developing on two very different paths? Professor Shen.
For the Iranian case, I think it's back to the right direction. America is willing to negotiate within the framework of JCPOA. The Biden government has brought America back to the process. But Iran said the U.S. need to lift a certain sanction. That is also reasonable. So this kind of mutual concession, America give more good return after Iran would honor its commitment to JCPOA, and it would enjoy more economic benefit. This is a right interaction between Washington and other capital of the six parties. And for Korean Peninsula, unfortunately, that's not the case. Pressed by the regional situation, Pyongyang may have a reason to shoot one after another in total by this time, in this year, already 12 times of various range of missiles. That must press Japan, South Korea, and China feel very upsetting. But North Korea has its own security argument that we need to respect. So I think we should make a North Korean situation back to the normal channel, back to Beijing for six-party talk in a new fashion.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We're going to continue our discussion about the issue after this break. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Today, our topic is the nuclear arms control. With us, Peter Kuznick from American University, Andrei Pavlov from St. Petersburg State University, Shending Li from Fudan University. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Earlier, we were talking about the possible arms race in terms of nuclear as a result of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and also some of the hotspot issues, such as Iran and Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Now, let me move on to also ask you, Professor Kuznick, about that. Now, with the world that is changing so fast, as you said earlier in the program, how much do you see governments are looking for answers by building up their nuclear arms program? And now, what do you think are some of the international treaties and guarantees that could prevent us, or at least help us, to prevent a utmost nuclear, shall I say, arms race?
Well, Tian, the situation was precarious even before the war with Russia and Ukraine started. We were already in a very dangerous situation. We've got 9 nuclear powers in the world today. All 9 are modernizing their nuclear arsenals. China and Britain are significantly increasing the size of their nuclear arsenals. There's more and more dependence on this. You know, you take the case of Ukraine. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine was the 3rd biggest nuclear power in the world. They gave up 1,900 strategic weapons, nuclear weapons, 2,500 tactical nuclear weapons. The idea there is that had Ukraine kept its nuclear arsenal, then it wouldn't have been invaded. We see that same lesson. That was the lesson that the North Koreans said that the Iraqis failed to make. That if Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, the United States would not have invaded. The same thing with Libya. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his not nuclear weapons, but weapons of mass destruction program, and made Libya vulnerable. So the lesson that the world is drawing is the wrong one from the standpoint of all of us who don't want to see nuclear war and nuclear proliferation. The idea is that countries need nuclear weapons, or else they're not secure, or else they want to be under a nuclear umbrella. So Ukraine wanted to join NATO, so it would be under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. But NATO did not want Ukraine as a member. So I'm seeing us going the wrong direction. I'm seeing modernization that's making nuclear weapons more efficient and more lethal. And the problem with future arms control is much more complicated than the past. We've got a lot of new things to think about.
Right.
Hypersonic weapons, growing efficiency of missile defense.
Yeah. But you know, Professor Kuznick, now the U.S. and Russia still counts for the majority of the nuclear arms of the world.
More than 90%.
Indeed. Yeah. So with that in mind, it is really about the responsibilities of these 2 countries. Of course, also others as well. But with the ever-escalating geopolitical tensions, many really wonder whether this gives the U.S. more excuses. Some say this is the most appropriate word to use, more excuses to build up more nuclear programs or nuclear storage inside Europe. Of course, with the acceptance of the latter. But, you know, what do you make of that possibility?
I'm not sure about that in terms of what that's going to mean. Right now, the U.S. has nuclear weapons in 5 European countries already. Are they going to increase that? I'm not sure. The United States is developing low-yield nuclear weapons now. The idea is to find weapons that are smaller and therefore more usable. It's very, very dangerous. The United States believes, many American experts believe, that Russia has a doctrine to escalate to de-escalate, to use limited nuclear war weapons in a crisis in order to show their seriousness and get the other side to back down. We're not sure if that's really the Russian doctrine or not. There's a lot of evidence that it's not. But there's just seems to be a much lower trigger or bar for use of nuclear weapons now. And Russia says that it won't use them unless it's under existential threat. We don't know how that's going to be defined as existential threat. I've seen a lot of things that I consider quite irrational coming out of Vladimir Putin lately, who's usually not irrational in what he says. So Russia is not doing well on the battlefield, clearly in Ukraine. And the economy in Russia is very threatened right now. So how is this going to play out in terms of Russia defining existential threats? We don't know. That's why everybody's alarmed and not wanting to have any extra cause for furthering this crisis.
Professor Pavlov.
But one of the consequences that I don't like is that this invasion has given the hawks more credibility everywhere.
Okay.
So Germany's building up its military, and other countries also.
All right. Professor Pavlov.
Well, I think that first of all, we witness now the problem of vertical proliferation rather than horizontal proliferation. I mean, when existing nuclear weapon states, they increase their nuclear arsenals. And another threatening perspective is that lack of arms control agreement and deterioration of, first of all, bilateral Russo-American nuclear arms control regime make it really difficult, more difficult to figure out what is actually strategic stability. And that make it possible to develop misperceptions, misunderstanding. It will destroy mutual transparency. And this is the most important thing, most immediate important thing, because not kind of a realistic clash of interests, but misperception can lead to rise of suspicions and then to conflict.
Right.
And I think we need to address that immediately.
Professor Pavlov, you said something very important. You said there is something about lack of the definition of what strategic stability is, which make people wonder, during the Cold War time, was there a clear definition of what strategic stability was? How would you compare it? Maybe this is not an appropriate one, because I hope we're still not in a new Cold War, but how do you see the lack of definition today?
Yeah, there was a definition, but it was applicable only to bilateral Russo-American relations in the sphere of nuclear arms control. And definition was included into joint statement in, I think it was in 1991 or 1990, that strategic stability is a situation when no side has incentive to strike first. Now, unfortunately, this definition is not enough, and the search for a new understanding of what is strategic stability, Russia and the United States started this consultation about a year ago, but they were suspended, of course, recently, and I'm not sure when and whether they will be continued, because now it's really difficult to resume them.
Thank you so much for your explanation. Professor Shen, it is very interesting that I hear a man of wisdom the other day talking about a quote coming from Mark Twain, suggesting that history does not repeat, but it rhymes. And that is the danger. So I really want to jump out of the specific discussion for the last question for you and talking about, are we forgetting the danger of nuclear wars or nuclear strikes? Are we forgetting the danger of lives being lost in world wars? Are we forgetting how our lives came into being today? I think that's a very important question we need to ask today?
We should not forget, but man can be foolish. We may not always be wise. Look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK threatened Khrushchev to withdraw Soviet short-range nuclear missile from the territory of Cuba, and under great security pressure, the then Soviet Union did. It's good. They care the global stability, even they lose face, but they made great concessions. But if the U.S. would deploy its nuclear weapon to Poland, to any country beyond the 5 existing countries where they host the U.S. nuclear weapon, that would be a single case to forget about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then the U.S. could commit a huge mistake. I have some sympathy for Ukraine, for the military operation conducted on its territory. But I would have no sympathy if the U.S. administration were to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of Poland. And Russia simply cannot tolerate this. Even though international law has not disallowed this kind of unfortunate event to happen. But realistically, we need to care the legitimate security concern of Russia.
All right.
That's my advice. We should never forget about the bad history, not to make it to recur.
We are almost running out of time. Very briefly, one sentence from both of you, just to be equal, Professor Pavlov and Professor Kuznick, for your final statement today. Professor Pavlov.
I agree that nuclear danger today is greater than in some periods of the Cold War.
Okay.
Because it seemed that some leaders, they don't really understand the way nuclear weapons have to be dealt with.
Okay, Professor Kuznick, one sentence, very briefly.
We have to stop this madness. Nuclear weapons are insane. The thought of using them is insane. And we've got to abolish that. The world, unfortunately, right now is going the other direction. But those of us who have a better understanding have got to prevail.
Peter Kuznick, Andrei Pavlov, Shending Li, thank you so much for being with us. That's all the time we have for today. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.